thank you very much. I appreciate the hospitality. I appreciate being here in Italy with you. I still remember the old days that you took the right to promote Envision in Italy and Europe, and it was quite a good time, and I'm going to talk about these things later. So let me see how I can start with my presentation.
Here you can use this one, Spiro.
So I have, is that my presentation? Yes, it is. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about planning sustainable cities. And the reason I'm going to go in that direction is simply because after Envision was very successful in the United States, and since my private job is about planning cities, I felt that we should apply Envision for planning cities. So it started from a need, and it started with a project. In other words, it was not theoretical academic work, but rather I was planning a city. It was in Pakistan. It was a great project, and we said, let's make it sustainable. At that time, Envision was being developed. That was 2012, 2013, and the research started very much applied. So let me continue and just share with you just a few very basic thoughts. And some of these things for you today appear to be commonplace, but this is how we started. We started with what today is known as circular economy, but basically we say it's not accepted for a city to import the good stuff and export the bad stuff. How about if we can go to a system that recycles, reuses, uses less, and eventually becomes a sustainable city that eventually it's going to become more and more sustainable as we know more. So this is a very basic idea about these graphics, and you don't need to take photographs because I'm going to give you the entire presentation, but of course you're welcome to do that. So basically, the concept is that you don't use the city as just a consumer, but the city is something that after it receives all the goods, recycles them, and eventually, actually, I'm going to pay more attention to reuses, but recycles as well. The next thing, that it is something that we have a lot of sensitivity, and today it's much more common, it is that we plan our cities to be primarily used by cars, not by people. I still remember doing some renewals of neighborhoods in Athens, Greece, and people were telling us that if they park their car, they don't want to move it because they will not find another parking spot. And I remember one of my students saying, eventually, we don't live in a city, we live in a parking lot that happens to have buildings in between the cars. And keep that, it's a very powerful message. So how can we plan our city to be more pedestrian? And of course, here today, we realized how nice it is to be in a pedestrian city. However, it's not enough just to have pedestrian walkways, because there was a big problem on how to come from the hotel here, Lorenzo, as you know pretty well, because that has to go with a lot more infrastructure, transportation, public transportation. And when we're dressed like this, it's more difficult to take an electric bike. But anyway, this may be the answer. But please remember this. We should not plan cities for cars. So let me go back and give you some background. The Zophnas program. And the Zophnas program was established in 2007 at Harvard by Paul and Joan Zophnas, philanthropists, who simply told us that it's not enough to have sustainable buildings, we have to have sustainable infrastructure. It was about the time that I met Anthony as well, and with a very small group of people, we started. And when we started with a very clear mission to develop a system that would rate the sustainability of infrastructure. So we did not start as a typical research project in a university, but we started very focused on what we want to do, and we said we must have it in 3 years. It was a time that there were several similar efforts in different parts of the world, very expensive, and did not make it. Why did we make it? Now I'm talking about Envision and not the cities yet. We made it simply because although we are in an academic environment, we had a very practice-oriented thinking. And we got several supporting members. I remember here we see only 5 of them, that they continue to support us simply because now sustainability is at a different grade. But I still remember Paul Zofnas in one of our meetings saying that here today we have the companies that they bill 75% of the world billing in civil works. It was said in the Harvard Faculty Club in one of the meetings. I have to say we're meeting very regularly. We had workbooks. We're developing our system in a rigorous and systematic way. Here I'm going to say also a few things, remembering Paul. Paul, in a way, he's not with us anymore. I mean, physically, he's not with us. He has a very serious illness. But I still remember him saying, you cannot improve something unless you can measure it. That was his motto. And the other thing he was saying is that many companies go to the different authorities, different governments, government organizations, and they say, I'm going to have a sustainable, project. And Paul was saying, how do they know what is more sustainable? So we need to measure, we need to have a leveled field. And having done all these things, we had, as I told you, a lot of workshops. And this program was at Harvard University until 2022. In 2022, I became emeritus. I pursued a different professional interest, more practice-oriented. So we moved it to the Institute of Sustainable Infrastructure that continues with Envision. Now, when we developed this program, we called it Z Simple, Z for Zofnas. Simple because we did not want to have it complicated. And I still am very proud that we have a system that it is relatively simple, but as the previous CEO of Institute of Sustainable Infrastructure used to say, it works very well. Bill Bertera used to say, it works very well. Until now, it has not failed. So we managed to have a system that we have to admit it is simpler than the other competing systems in Australia or the UK, and it works very, very well. So it embodies more the American way of thinking, I hope the Italian way of thinking as well. So after that, the system was developed, ISI started, we were very proud about it. And let me say also something here that I believe it's a good lesson learned. If you happen to have a product, like we had it at Harvard University, if you keep it for yourself, it never becomes useful simply because it stays on the shelf of the research facilities. What we did is we said at that time to the American Society of Civil Engineers, take it and use it. The only thing we asked them is to use it, nothing else. And with first the American Society of Civil Engineers and then 2 other organizations that Anthony is going to talk more about it, they formed ISI, and ISI has thrived. And I'm so happy to be here today with so many people that we're talking about Envision almost 20 years after we started. So this is a great success and a great satisfaction. Not necessarily financial satisfaction, but for academics, that's not the important thing. So we started looking at using Envision for other things, because Envision now had a life of its own. ISI was doing an amazing job. And we said, where else can we use what we have developed? And we started looking at planning cities and planning cities based on Envision. And this is what I'm going to present to you very quickly on a few slides. The first is that a city is like a project. Envision is project-based, and this is what we're very proud of. And a city is nothing more than a project, just much bigger. And the 5 areas that they were set up, 4 of them in 2007, quality of life, resource allocation, natural world, and climate and risk. They were set up at our first meeting, the 1st of February of 2008. I give you some historic information. The leadership part came from Envision. We had not thought at Harvard because we felt everybody wants to be sustainable. And they said we have to give some credits to those who want to be sustainable. And then looking at the project, the city as a project, we say that if we want to have a sustainable city, we have to start with planning. And then we have to plan the infrastructure and then look at the buildings and look at a system. And the important thing here was the system thinking that I don't know exactly who was the author, probably was AECOM at that time, and EDO specifically. They had a very forward-looking CEO, and since we had contacts with the industry and everything was developed with the industry, AECOM said, we have to look at the city as a system. We cannot make just sustainable rails or sustainable roads or sustainable water treatment facilities, but we have to look at the whole thing. And eventually the buildings come part of it, and always thinking on the basics of 5 areas. And then we looked at these 5 areas, and I always remind myself, every time I talk about sustainability, I think about those. Again, quality of life, which is extremely important, and then resource allocation, how we affect the natural world, climate and risk, which was very forward thinking at that time. Resilience was not talked that much, and leadership. And then we have 3 different areas. The planning of the city, the infrastructure systems, but as systems because they're interacting. What I found out as we're doing the Pakistani project is that we could produce energy, but to produce energy we had 2 ways, either consume a lot of water or not consume a lot of water with other effects, with more pollution. So water and electricity go together. The same thing when we wanted to have a landscaping of the city, it was requiring water. So all these systems-wise, they make a lot of sense. And then we look at all these areas. And eventually, we do the planning. The planning determines the demand for infrastructure. And after we know the demand, based on people, density, kind of buildings, then we start having a system. But the interesting thing here is that it goes back and forth. It's not a linear process. And then we say that infrastructure is quite important for the economic development of the city. I say the obvious things here, that they lead to social development and inclusion. 2007, we're not talking so much about inclusion. These were all very ideas that they have developed ever since. And eventually, we started talking about resilience and what happens if we have a big shock and changes the way that the city operates and how we need to recover. And very important, something that I'm afraid until today we do not pay enough attention by having a separate system for infrastructure, which is Envision, and a separate system for buildings, that it is LEED. And let me say my bias here, I believe Envision is much better and simpler and to the point. And I always think that we should expand our sustainability to buildings, not only the way that the LEED looks at buildings, but the way we look at the buildings on the 5 areas, and also how they interact with infrastructure. because buildings can be the producers of energy, can recycle water, can consume less, so it's immediately related to how much infrastructure we need. And this is a very good research topic that we have pursued up to a point. One reason is that we try to keep our fields a little separate, but in a research institution you can always think in this bigger way. And because buildings are also the main generators of waste, not buildings themselves, but people, they live in buildings, and you understand where I go. So let's go now to the planning guidelines, and I have until...
You can talk until 5 past...
Oh, I have plenty of time. So let's talk about the planning guidelines. And then we developed a book. And just to show how old we are, we developed a book with this kind of colors that some people told us this remembers a particular sign and flag of some other organizations. Nevertheless, we kept it. And then we started thinking about how we can plan sustainable cities. And let me go to just a very simple example in one of the simplest to visualize infrastructure systems, which is waste disposal. And this is how we looked at that at the city we're planning in Pakistan again. So if you look at the entire system, you can follow what happens on each line. In other words, you have the recyclables, you have the trash, you have sludge, and then go to different facilities and continue, and all the way, some of them go to landfill, some of them go to reusing, recycling. And if you look at that, let's say someone wants to design a sustainable landfill or a sustainable recycling station. It's not the right way to approach. You should approach the entire line, the entire vertical production all the way to the end. And when we say to production, this is where the buildings come back in the same place. Not only that, but you see some trucks carrying material. Those trucks are using the transportation infrastructure. They have exhausts. So one of the questions is, where do you place those facilities? So you minimize travel, you minimize transportation, you convince people that it's a good idea to have those facilities within the city, something that we strongly believe, as I'm going to show you later. So think about that, and the same thing applies, and we have developed graphs for every type of infrastructure. And then we said, okay, what are the different types of infrastructure we want to address? And here we address hard infrastructure. If there is one thing that's missing is the behavior of people to use all these things better. But basically we identified 7 different areas: energy, water, and water includes wastewater, food, solid waste, transportation, landscape, and information. Let me stop at 2 things that they are more interesting here. They have become quite issues of discussion. The first is about food. Should we import food in the city or produce food in the city? And the point is, we want to make that it makes sense to produce food in the city, which actually makes the city to be much more sustainable. And it's an opportunity to use some old multi-story buildings for food production, as we start seeing that happening in the United States. But food is one of the areas that it's not perceived to be at par with the others. But let me talk about landscape. Landscape simply means the open space in the cities. And the open space in the cities is as important as the cities themselves. We never found a good English word for landscape. Open space, it's not exactly that. Landscape includes all the parks, but at the same time, how we treat water, how we treat animals in the city, birds. So it's much more complex. But very important, and not only that, but takes a lot of space of the city together with transportation. So, having identified those, what we did next was to start looking again at the different 7 areas and then start doing a systems level analysis. And in the system levels analysis, we identified 4 different levels that I'm going to explain. And then after that, we have actions. And all these are very well presented in the book. And you see that after the levels, we have the 5 areas that we defined before for each level. And then we go to planning guidelines, which are a set of actions to make sure that we achieve the sustainable infrastructure. So let me talk about these 4 levels. It's going to look to you as being simple. I can tell you it took us about 6 months to determine this particular methodology. The first level is we determine the demand for the consumption. How much transportation we need, how much water do we need, how much electricity we need. And the second one is what is the strategic approach to achieve that? In other words, transportation. Is the strategic approach to have pedestrians or bicycles or cars or trains? And then it is what are the facilities that perform, which are the nodes, like the stations. And then the network, how all these nodes are connected. And this applies to, believe it or not, all the areas of, that I mentioned before, the 7 areas of infrastructure. So here we start putting all of them for each one of the infrastructure systems. I cannot spend much time in looking at each one of them. Each one of them has a very nice, symbol, following the tradition of the Zophnas program that has been very well accepted by Envision until today. And you can see that we are able to define the demand analysis and then the strategic way to approach it. And the next thing, and this is another, I believe I tell you very common sense things, but if I say that there is something of value, is that they are systematically presented, not that they are really very important. But the most important thing is savings, reduce demand. It is not to make a sustainable system by itself. In other words, how good is it that some people live in the United States, let's say, a 4-member family in a 600 square meter house, and they make it very sustainable, so they use all kinds of energy production and water savings, when it's so big that at the end of the day, regardless of the savings, they consume more than if you live in Paris in 30 square meters or 40 square meters. So savings is the most important. So we need to make sure that we install the smaller needed infrastructure in a city. And the next thing is the synergies, how all these areas are interacting to each other. And then if we look specifically about the transportation infrastructure, that give us a very simple example, is that we start with very simple things. We plan the city, or we operate on an existing city. And then we start thinking about trip generation. For trip generation, we start looking at attractors and generators of trips. And then we start looking at how the transportation is going to be within the city, and then we start developing the nodes of that transportation. You can think of it even in electric cars like Zipcar, where you put all the cars, and how they're connected, which are the roads, and so on. And after that, we start looking at the Zophnas areas, and then we start looking at what are the objectives, and eventually the planning guidelines. And here, this is where it links with Envision. For each one of our actually looking at trip generators, we start connecting with the Envision areas. And when you see something that it is more, actually, the color, you can see the color, means it is directly related. If you see it fade, it's not so much related. So this is where we start connecting with Envision, and everything that I say today is based on Envision. And when I say based on Envision, it comes back to Envision and looks at the credits of Envision. And here, for example, I put about the trip generator again, and I start looking at the guidelines, and the guidelines, for example, is provide mixed-use development, which is my favorite, which we don't see in many cities. And so on, and then we start looking how the project teams are going to translate the guidelines to context-specific actions looking back at Envision. And eventually, we start going back and look at the 5 categories, which is always like our Bible. In other words, we do a sustainable project. Does it improve quality of life? Does it protects the natural world? Does it address the issues of climate and resilience, and so on? And these are the way that we propose to do cities, and I'm going to go very quickly and tell you that after the Pakistani project, we applied this in a very important project for Athens, Greece. Now I apply the same things for the planning of secondary cities in Sierra Leone in Africa with the World Bank project. We have applied it for national urban assessments in countries in Asia with the Asian Development Bank. So there is a lot of potential, and all these things, believe me, they're directly applicable. And at the end of the day, we can measure. So let me show you about this project, and I'm going to do it in 5 minutes, so it's going to be very quickly. In Athens, there was an airport. This airport was in the middle of the city, and this airport was decided to be redeveloped as an urban development. Now, the advantage is that it is completely empty, so we can do very many different things. It is near the city, and I happen to be the designer for that area. And of course, knowing planning guidelines, knowing Envision, that was our opportunity. So we started looking at the different planning scales, and then you see that very quickly I come to something different, like soil, lead, water, energy, air, health and comfort, awareness, and innovation, because we simply cannot stay always very much limited to the framework that we have developed. And eventually we said we have 8 different goals. And see how simple they are. Number 1, self-sufficient city. Yes, it is within Athens, but it has to be self-sustainable. What does that mean? Even the waste facility should be within the city. Production of energy as much as we can within the city. The second one, to minimize car use and make sure it's connected to the surrounding communities for the people. It's not a gated community. Next, to start using the existing roadways, redirect them, and plan it so that it supports a pedestrian city. Create a huge park and allow accessibility to the waterfront, which is really fantastic. Start doing land use synergies, look at sustainable infrastructure and renewable energy, and then create compact neighborhoods. At that time, the 15-city concept was not so much said. I would say 15-minute concept neighborhoods, and then eventually do housing that supports the infrastructure. And we started looking at each one of them. We did very specific things. One of the, I believe, successes of what we did is we did not start with the roads for cars. We started with the pathways for people. And we made sure that every 300 meters there was something for pedestrians especially during the day, that they could stop or they could see something. So it was a network of pathways, and we minimized the crossing of cars. And here I address all these these 8 areas. And you can always see how Envision is shown as actually it was solid coloring or fade coloring depending on the applicability. And eventually we sort of cheated here because we used the Envision checklist. Although in Pakistan we went through ISI and we got an award at that time, but here we did a checklist just because we want to go faster, and then we put the yes and no you can see in every category, and I believe we did pretty well. And eventually we started looking at the different guidelines as they have been defined and presented in the book, and eventually this is the final plan. It's not going to be done like this, because when developers come in, when they see money from a different way, I have to admit that this is where you lose the battle. But anyway, and eventually we looked at transportation, especially transportation, and eventually we looked at demand analysis, how many people live in the different areas, how much they need to move, what are the modes of transportation, and so on. I'm going to show this very quickly. The slides are going to be available to you. One of the main things we did is we redirected. Here there was a very wide avenue. It was very near the waterfront. We put it up there, and our innovation was that we used the existing airfields for the highway or for this wide avenue. Why? Because some other proposals were to take all the concrete out, and then there was the question where the concrete is going to go. So this is where you need to think creatively, reduce waste, and that was a very good way to reduce waste. And eventually, I will go quickly. I'm going to show you how it looked at the time that we were planning it, just an empty space. And basically, this concludes the presentation. So, planning guidelines, they're available. We tried also to apply them in northern Italy. We had some very interesting discussions in Torino with some very good friends that they were always part of the actually softness program and Envision and ISI. And we find out that as Envision works, this works as well. And it's guideline, so it is simple. It does not simply put you in a straitjacket. And this is the advantage of this. So I will stop here. If you have any questions, I will be glad either now or later to answer. And I urge you to use it, and I urge you to use it in existing cities. Both Pakistan and here there were empty fields. In Sierra Leone there are existing cities, and in Sierra Leone also we have another problem. It's a very poor country, so you have to be very careful what you propose. Very good. Thank you.